talking to myself again. Hi, everyone. I had myself muted. I don't know how many times that happens in a week, but it's quite frequent. Thanks for joining me this afternoon in the second session that we're talking about grammar. And I hope to build on some of the conversations that we had last week, or some of the content, and allow you to do some question asking and conversations more today than last week. For those of you who were here last week, was there anything that you were able to try out or do? I know it's only been a few days of in-school time, but have you been able to talk to your pupils about grammar in any way?
No.
You can jump on the microphone if you'd like to, or leave a message in chat. Oh, now I'm trying to get back to chat. That would be fun. Janet, I think Janet, you're there. If someone's got something in chat, will you let me know? I'm finding it a bit tricky to jump between both. Anyway, all right.
Yes, I will.
It's tricky. Here we go. I found it again. Okay, great. Hello. Okay, great. Introducing yourselves, that's great too. Okay, so hopefully you can see the screen, and I've just dropped a link into the chat box that will take you to these exact slides or handouts so you can have a look. And if you weren't here last week, I'll do a little bit of an overview to show where things fit. But this is the second in 3 sessions, maybe more if we're interested and want to keep going a little bit. Last week I spoke about word level grammar in context, and we were looking at the examples of verbs and how our teachers taught us that verbs are doing words, but in fact they do a lot more than that. And we looked at a 4-step process that's based around conceptualizing that teaching of grammar. So we're no longer wanting to see lots of decontextualized kinds of exercises. We want to do something more with the teaching of grammar, and that's what today is about as well. I'm using the same 4-step process, but today I'm going to talk about how you might use that to teach some sentence level kinds of concepts. And at any stage, if you've got questions, please feel free to jump in, but I will leave some time at the end, about 15 to 20 minutes, for us to have a conversation. We can talk about the content itself, you know, what are these grammatical concepts, or we can talk about the pedagogy. Next week, the last one in this round is around text level grammar. And text level grammar is when we're talking about a genre in its, you know, final stages, which is really what we're doing at certain stages with these other ones as well. But what I'll do then is talk through the whole writing process and help you work out what is the grammar that you should be teaching. As I mentioned last week, the CFE is very difficult to read. You have to look at the implicit understandings that are there. I'm going to give you an example of that in a moment. So what we can do is work from almost backwards. We work from what kinds of texts are you having to ask your pupils to read and to write, and we use that as the groundwork to find out what grammar you should be teaching. So that's what we'll do next week. What we know about teaching grammar from research, and again, you might have heard a little bit of this last week, is that any of those exercises that we do, say our entire grammar program is about writing exercises, you know, find the noun in this sentence, find the verb in this sentence. We know that if that's the entirety of your grammar pedagogy, then you're going to have students who can answer those types of questions in their standardized tests, but who don't transfer that into the context of writing. Okay, so it will help them answer knowledge-based questions, but it has no effort in transforming their writing practice. Now, think about what the purpose should be. Should it be about answering questions on a test, or should it be about being writers? And of course, that's the answer. So we are not about using an exercise book for grammar. We're not about having lots of fill-in types of questions. We're not about placing this type of learning only in the writing curriculum. And it's not about punctuation. A lot of time, even in the curriculum, and this goes for Scottish curriculum and curriculum in Australia, everywhere, we lump grammar and punctuation together. Those of us who aren't as confident will see grammar as punctuation and will miss all of the important grammatical concepts that need to be taught. So you need to see them as two different things. What it should be about is contextualizing. So every time you want to teach a new concept, you need to embed it in literature, in experiences, in talk, in reading and writing, so that it has high level of transfer from the student's knowledge and skill into their writing, or their use of knowledge of grammar to comprehend. And again, I'll share you an example with that. It is about teachers having strong knowledge, and I discussed this last week, the fact that we've got a generation of us, those of us who were sort of born anywhere before the 1970s, anywhere in the 70s, into the 80s. If you went to school in the last 30, 40 years, you're likely to have been caught up in this overflow where we didn't teach grammar explicitly. The history of that is that we had for many years, up until about the 60s or 70s, done all of the exercises as our teaching. When we found that that wasn't working, we threw that out, but instead of replacing it with something more productive, we just let it sort of disappear. And so myself, I wasn't taught grammar at school, and maybe that was the case for you. Now we are the teachers, and our knowledge, being as it is, means that we're not able to transfer that into our pupils. So what we need to do is stop this, creative churning of no knowledge of grammar. It's coming back into fashion because we know that it's so vital to not only our writing, but our comprehension as well. So you don't need a textbook, but what you do need is access to lots of literature, lots of children's literature, picture books, novels, poems, rap lyrics, song lyrics, websites, non-fiction texts, anything you can lay your hands on that has some kind of model or example of the concept that you are teaching. You need to be a teacher who writes and reads as well, because part of this will be your responsibility to create texts that your students can innovate and mark and look for the things that you are wanting to teach them. It is about scaffolding. So unlike the lovely exercises that we might have been able to give at 9 a.m, nice and easy, we need to scaffold. We need to think about the gradual release of responsibility to the children. Some people like to talk about that as I do, we do, you do. Not a fan of that, but I am a fan of thinking about releasing the responsibility to children. So us modelling first, sharing the responsibility, and then allowing them to have opportunities to put that into practice. And thirdly, I can't even count. Lastly, definitely you have to have some understanding of how curriculum works, because it is imperative to be able to pick out what sorts of things that you are having to teach. With the CFE, I'm not sure that that's even doable. What is doable is, as I said before, concentrate on the text types or the genres that you need to teach and work backwards. And that's what we'll talk about next week. So here's an example of why your knowledge is really important of grammar. I took this one, E&O, that says users grammar to read with understanding. And I've cut out, this is the beauty of curriculum, isn't it? One statement means 50 different things. But we want to look at this one section. Uses grammar to read with understanding. Okay, this is a level 1. Now, on the other side, you should be able to see a little box. And this is something that I read in a newspaper probably 5 or 6 years ago. And it was the announcement of the funeral of a woman who had been murdered in a town close to where I lived. And it said, she was a loving mother, a caring sister, a wonderful daughter, and a wife. Can you tell from that funeral announcement who murdered her? I could. Right? She had been missing for a number of days. Her body was found on the banks of a river. There was, lots of work going on around who could have done it, where it could have happened. But as soon as I read that, I realised that someone was under a lot of suspicion. Can you work out who did it?
Husband?
Yeah, exactly. He was arrested, I think, a day or two later. What's the grammatical element there that told me something wasn't right? Can you work it out? No
positive adjective, yeah.
And this is, I knew this because as a knowledgeable person about grammar, I knew that the absence of an adjective is sometimes just as powerful or more powerful than having an adjective. And that the business of there not being an adjective before the noun wife was signalling big things to me. So grammar can also be about critical literacy. It's so important that you yourself have that kind of knowledge so that you can give these examples and talk to children about this as well. I'm happy for you to use my example there. It was quite frightening to read, but that's what happened. He is in jail, though, you'll be happy to know. So what's sentence level? When you think about sentences, there are a whole heap of kind of concepts that we could look at. The one that you probably think of straight away is the types of sentences, simple, compound, complex, and then compound, complex. How do you feel about your knowledge in relation to those concepts? Do you feel confident? Whoops, what have I done? What have I done? Sorry, everyone, just a second. I can't see you. Okay, I'm back. Not very confident. And that's something I'm seeing more and more. As I said, we can't be blamed for that. It's the experience that we've had at school. But the knowledge of sentences is something that could go with every single type of concept or text that you're trying to teach pupils or students, because of course our texts are made up of sentences making beautiful paragraphs, clauses making those sentences. So if it's not something that you are completely comfortable in, I suggest you have a look at some information about those. There are absolutely wonderful little clips on YouTube to help you with that. What it means for writers is that we get a different level of complexity in the different types of sentences that we write. From a simple sentence which has one clause and it's an independent clause, it can stand all on its own, to clauses that are dependent and need something else, usually an independent clause, to help them. Now, imagine, again, I think I said this to you last week, if you're a mechanic, you wouldn't, or you owned a car, you wouldn't take your car to a mechanic who didn't understand how the engine worked. And so for us, it's about knowing how language works. Clauses are another one. They can be very complicated and confusing at the start, but the beauty of the English language and teaching it is that you don't always have to be 100% right. Now, I was still in classes with my pre-service teachers. We might be talking about a sentence and trying to work out whether it's complex or compound complex. And it's okay to say, oh, that's a tricky one. I'm going to have to think about that some more, which I think, you know, everybody should feel comfortable at doing. The other thing that we can talk about, and this is probably something that you would do in all levels of primary school, but I'm also assuming that there are a lot of older pupils who would like to know this, that there are different purposes for the sentences or the statements that we make, including whether they're statements, questions, commands, or exclamations. And fourth that I've put here, and probably most importantly, is understanding how the sentence is trying to either make us feel, make us think, make us believe, and how we as writers can take control of sentences to push our ideas, our thoughts, our meanings out onto our audience, which is exactly what all authors do. We want to present a particular stance or a particular idea. All right, just having a look there at chat. Okay, good, okay. Michael, I'm so glad that you're feeling confident. That's great. Now, these aren't all of the ideas, but these are the ones that I have taught in primary school, definitely. The Scottish curriculum, very interestingly, doesn't even use the term clauses in the literacy in English curriculum, I don't think. Well, you can't really write a sentence until you understand what a clause is. And you can't really write a clause unless you understand what a verb is. So I think there's a lot of intuitive work that you have to do as a teacher to try to make this obvious to yourself and to your pupils. So last week I talked to you about 4 steps. This comes from Reedy in 2013. It's a book about the teaching of grammar, but you might be able to find something online about it. Its acronym is REDM, I think, REDM, Approach to Grammar, which basically means reading and investigation at the beginning, some explicit teaching where you might bring in some of those ideas around exercises and examples, discussion and experimentation, and then using the grammar in really sort of structured, carefully managed ways. Okay? So what I'm going to do is the same thing I did last week, which is look at 1 or 2 concepts about sentences and take you through what that might look like. And this is something, again, you might be teaching primary, you might be teaching secondary. There will be pupils who need this information. So you should be able to kind of tease it out or simplify a little bit for different ages. So this is reading and investigation. And in this kind of experience, in this kind of activity, I do things like visualization. So reading to the pupils and getting them to visualize what they are hearing about just from the words. There's this lovely little leap that happens for young students when they suddenly realize the power of words, that what they're hearing is making these lovely images in their mind. The next extension of that is to get them to do some sketching. So while you're reading, they're doing a sketch to represent what they're seeing or hearing about. I would choose very carefully the passages from a longer text that I would ask them to sketch, because you need it to be almost a point in time for them to be able to sketch. One thing I like to do is to modify texts as well. So what I've got here for you is an example from another teacher, and you can read about this teacher's work. I'm going to give you a link. And she was reading A Wrinkle in Time to her students. So what you see on the right hand of the screen, the longer text, was the original text. But what she did was on the left. she modified the text to take out all of the really interesting parts of the sentence. For example, just look at the first one, Meg knelt, to Meg knelt at her mother's feet. Okay. Now, as I said before, you could do this with a very simple picture book by taking out all the adjectives and adverbs, or you can do it with more complicated text like this novel. And what she did with the pupils was that she asked them to visualise and sketch with the first example, which was her modified text. Right? Meg knelt, she was relaxed, so her fears were gone. The cocoa steamed in the saucepan. Geraniums bloomed on the sills, and there were chrysanthemums. The curtains were drawn. The furnace purred, the lights glowed. Outside, alone in the dark, the wind still battered against the house, but the power was subdued. Fortinbras let out a sigh. And when she then read the second version to them, they realised the power of what you put into your sentences. So just for a second, have a skim of that second longer text and see the difference. So even though we're comparing large amounts of texts here, I would be taking particular sentences from this and using those as focal points to do some direct instruction, which is next. What the teacher did as well was to ask different levels of questions for comprehension around each text. So from the start, the first reduced text, she asked them, who do you think Fortinbras is? And of course, we get no hint of who Fortinbras is from the first text, other than it's someone who would sigh. Now, from the second text, you've got someone who's under the chair. Who would be under the chair? It could be a child, but it's more likely to be a dog or a cat, isn't it? So, as I said, this teacher's practice has been explained in an article that I'm going to give you the link to, because there were a number of activities that the teacher did with this text. So what do you think about that? Do you think it's something that you could do yourself? In my experience, modifying text is tricky the first few times you do it, but you are likely to get better at it. Remember last week I talked to you about this one. This is as simple as it can get, because, let me give you an example. This text has only a phrase on every page, which has a number, an adjective, and a noun. So I would modify this text by simply taking away the adjective, and it would be 6 steps. And then we could work out how we could make this phrase into a sentence with much more information in it. Okay? So although it might be tricky to start with, it's good practice to get into, even if you're doing it, as this teacher did, with 1 paragraph of text. Okay, so that's the reading and investigation. We were doing lots of comparing of those 2 types and what it means to you as a reader. How do you comprehend? Oh, yes, Janet, absolutely. That's the trick that will come, because in the 4th step, when you're doing some writing, you could have the students modifying text then. You're absolutely right. They quite like making something better, and it's even more interesting to make something worse in some ways. In explicit teaching, we talked about this last week with looking at particular word level text, but in this one, again, this is almost a semi kind of process in itself. So if we were looking at sentences that had lots of information in them that were helping the reader to visualize, we might be talking about noun groups. Okay, so let's expand the noun group. Let's not just say the quiet cat. Let's say the quiet fluffy cat, or whatever it is that you want to do to expand that noun group. But you might be looking at statements, commands, questions, and exclamations. And in that case, you would choose a text in the first round that would assist you to do that. One of my favourites, absolutely love this author, David Shannon. This one is called Good Boy Fergus. I absolutely love it. I've used this text with young children, but I've also used them with the first couple of years of secondary. And the reason I love it for this particular topic is that it is absolutely full of exactly what we're talking about there. Statements, commands, questions, and exclamations. So one thing I've done with this, again, if we're going backwards in time here, I should have done this in the last here. If we're going back to look at this and investigate, some of the things I've done is to cover the text and ask the students to predict whether it's going to be a statement, a command, a question, or an exclamation. You could do, you know, for example, even covering up the question mark there makes them think about what might be next. So this one isn't absolutely beautiful for that one, but it just depends on what type of content you're teaching. You know, maybe you're teaching about the types of sentences in terms of simple sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences, and how they affect meaning. So in that case, you could use the example from A Wrinkle in Time, and you could categorize the types of sentences that are there. Maybe you're just teaching about complex sentences. So you'd be looking for the complex sentences in there and comparing how they work compared to the simple sentences and things like that. And looking at how it affects meaning. There is another section of A Wrinkle in Time where the character moves to another setting. And you'll notice a really big change in the use of adjectives in that particular section when the author is talking about the setting. And of course, so then you say to your students, why do we see fewer adjectives here? And the conversations and the reasons for that means, you know, as an author, you're taking control. Of course, for this author, we could maybe predict or infer. I can't think, is that the right term? That the setting isn't all that important there. It's more important to think about what the character's doing or what they're thinking. So it's that reduction of adverbs or adjectives as well. So in that case, this is where I would be doing lots of writing as a teacher. As I said, students love to play, you know, find the errors the teacher's made. So I'll often do models where I've overdone the adjectives or underdone, or as you've probably seen in one of those really great memes, write an entire paragraph of short sentences or an entire paragraph of simple sentences, and then look at how it affects the reading and the meaning that's being made. Lots of opportunities there, but this is done explicitly. The third step is about discussion and experimentation. And here is when you want the pupils, the students, to be in charge of playing around with that idea. So if it's, for the example here, I'm giving about statements, commands, questions, and exclamations. I've done things like freeze frames. So we choose something that's happening in the story. Let's see, that would be a bit tricky. Something like this, and the students have to reproduce this in person by standing by freezing. And then you ask what the character might say, but it has to be a statement, or it has to be a question, or it has to be an exclamation. The same thing goes for hot seats, where you can ask them to give a statement that the character might give, or give a question that the character might ask. One that I really like doing here that is perfect for looking at these differences is called Conscience Alley. So you hand the students a card each, and on that card is one of the 4 different purposes. So I might collect a card and mine says command. Okay. So one student and or the teacher will walk through 2 lines of students, okay, walk through, and as they're walking through, as the character, the children on each side will either say their statement, command, question, or exclamation, as if they were the character in the middle. So I'm walking through in the middle, and perhaps I'm being Fergus, who is an awesome dog and is called a good dog all the time. He's a good boy, but he's really not. He does nothing that his owner asks him to do. If the owner says sit, he stands. So as I'm walking through, I might have someone say a statement. Fergus, although your owner said you're a good dog, you're not. A command. Do what your owner told you. A question. Why are you always doing the wrong thing, Fergus? Or an exclamation. Stop, whatever it is. This is such an easy way to get children to see the different purposes in sentences or statements. The only caveat is there is that sometimes the character, if the character has done things that are slightly controversial or perhaps involve emotions, I have seen Conscience Alleys get kind of built up emotionally, but you'll be able to work that out. And here at the experimentation, I would also be doing the modification or innovation on texts. You know, so what if Fergus really was a good boy? So how would the statements, how would the questions, the commands and the exclamations change if he really was a good dog and did what he was told? Again, this discussion and experimentation depends on the concept that you're teaching. So you can use freeze frames, hot seats, modifying text and Conscience Alleys for other concepts that you might be looking at. For example, complex sentences. Okay. The fourth one is the writing, and here's where we very carefully control the type of writing that might be done. So it's not a free-for-all write, and it's not an entire writing process for writing a particular text type or genre, but very controlled kinds of writing. And the one that I've used here previously is to have the pupils write an explanation of what makes a dog good. And of course, we make the argument that even though Fergus is terribly naughty and doesn't follow instructions, he's still a good dog. So it's lovely sort of qualitative work that they do around what makes a pet or a dog good. And again, if you're looking for statements, commands, questions, and explanations, then that's what you'll ask for in your explanation. If you're looking for different kinds of sentences or different sentence lengths, then that's what you will look for in the criteria that you set. But it's always important to think about audience, who's going to read it, what's the purpose to it, and what choices can you give to the pupils in that writing to make it really interesting and worth them doing. We have to remember here, as I said, this is a small kind of controlled writing experience. It's not the entire curriculum cycle and the writing process altogether. It's quite a specific writing task for that particular type of grammatical concept. Next week, though, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So grammar at text level, bring in some more of that writing. As with last week, the same sorts of things could be done for assessment, because it's incredibly important to not only prove that what you're doing is having an impact, but also that what you need to redo, go back and revisit. So during the formative assessment stages, where I would be using observation and checklists. For example, in Conscience Alley, you might be writing or ticking off that the children were able to, if they were given the card that said statement, were they able to make a statement? If they were given the question card, were they able to do that? During the explicit teaching, you might take some work samples from the pupils. You might look at some examples of sentences that they've written in response to your modelling, in response to you sharing that responsibility with them, and you might judge it against some criteria. Observation and anecdotal notes for the discussion and experimentation that might be going on. And then once the controlled writing samples have been made, you could use them to look at in a more focused way. Makes it a little easy. So I wonder how this compares to what sort of teaching you're doing in the classroom at the moment, or the type of teaching that seems to work for your pupils, and whether there are some areas or lots of areas that you might be able to use in your own teaching experience. Lastly, same as last week, lots of people ask me about what text to get, and these are the two that I would absolutely guarantee as being worthwhile: a new grammar companion and essential primary grammar. I did forget last week to mention, where is it? All of the David Crystal books. Excuse me for a moment while I move it was kind of holding me up. Any of the David Crystal books about making sense, not this one, but his work is just a lovely narrative about the English language and what needs to go into it. And I have found lots of things in his books that I use as kind of interest generating statements for my students. Okay, I'll put you back under there. Right, so to remind you that next week we're looking at text level, if you'd like to come along and see that, and I think that's the end. So what I'm going to do is stop sharing, and I'll come back and we can have a bit of a chat about some of those things. Stop sharing. Okay. All right. Would anyone like to make a comment about whether they think this is something that could fit into what they're doing? Or what might be some of the barriers or questions?
Kylie, I think what I really like about what you're saying is the sort of joined up nature of it all, that not just doing something in isolation. And even when, you know, I think about teaching higher English, for example, that's about, you know, the grammar feeds into the writing, feeds into the reading comprehension, feeds into everything else. So that really, really appeals to me. And I think, you know, when teaching higher English, constantly thinking of ways to, you know, link it all together and to sort of try to prove to pupils that actually the work that we're doing in writing is also going to help you for reading for understanding and all that kind of stuff as well. So that really appeals to me.
Yeah, I think we know we've got a crowded curriculum. Every curriculum is crowded. But a grammar lesson, a good grammar lesson should involve comprehension. It should involve writing, you know, it should involve vocabulary because you're using lots of terminology. So that you can really make it worth its weight by having something based off literature, based off different types of grammatical concepts, having some writing and reading involved in it. It can do all of those things. Makes it worth your while as a teacher. Yeah. Does anybody use or any other great picture books that they know or have used for teaching grammar? I have another one. Let me know if you've got something that you love to use. I think because I'm Australian, I don't really have any choice, that I grew up with a lot of these types of text. One of my favourite authors is Jeannie Baker. Can you see this? Am I in there somewhere? You can see me? I'll get rid of the chat. Okay. So, okay. This book is probably one of my favourite books of all, and that's saying something because I have a million favourites. But Window is a completely wordless picture book. And again, I've taught using this in secondary and primary. If you haven't seen it before, very simple premise is that every time you turn the page, you're seeing 2 years worth of change out the window. Okay. And so it's basically, it's about sustainability and well, the lack of sustainability in this particular town. But without words, you're opened up to the option of recreating the image in words. And here again, if you're looking at making sentences full of visual detail, the use of adjectives, then rewriting the page can be quite interesting. What I've done before is to give, I think there are about 10 openings. So giving a pair of students one opening and having them write outside the window, we see. And then, of course, when you put them all together, you have a class novel or a class book that you can then use. As the teacher, you might write your own model that perhaps isn't great, that needs work. Perhaps the sentences are all short. Perhaps you've only used one type of sentence. You know, all of those things. You know, you really just need a great selection of text, and your grammar is, you know, there. Jeannie Baker, you can probably see her illustrations are made from their mosaics, collages. In real life, they're massive, they're meters wide, and then they're photographed. She uses natural materials. There's lots of conversations you can have there, and she's done a ton of books. A lot of them have that environmental sustainability kind of concept as well. So I would love to hear from you. You know, if there are any texts that you use in particular. What I do when I'm looking for really good texts is I go to the competitions. I'll look at, you know, which ones won Children's Book of the Year, because generally they've got some really qualitative of stuff about that. Yeah, exactly, Pamela. That when I first started writing for my students, I couldn't believe how excited they got by looking at my writing, and the confirmation that the first time you write something doesn't mean it's the end. You know, the first time you write something, you then build on it, you change it. And so that for me is probably one of the most powerful actions you can make as a teacher, is to be a writer and reader yourself. Okay, everyone. Well, if aren't any more questions or thoughts, then I'm really happy that you were here to hear me rave on about my obsession. I'll put the link. Actually, I did. I put the link to the handout on Twitter if you haven't got it from here. And I'll see you next week. Please feel free to share the information about next week's with anyone that you think would like to come along, and we'll talk about something you might not know called top-level structure, which is a grammatical element at text level that will blow your mind and change your writing. So I'll see you next week if you've got some time to come along.